It gives me great satisfaction and pleasure to begin this quarter's lecture series with the contribution of my esteemed colleague, Professor Jason Schlude, who's Associate Professor of Classics at the College of St. Benedict's and St. John's University, co-director of the Umbrid settlement excavation, which is exploring, as I understand, a late Roman temple complex in Umbrid in northern Israel, and presently a Getty scholar at the Villa. So I would like to thank the Getty colleagues for facilitating these academic exchanges between the Getty and the Pura Center at UCLA for the second year as part of the Getty's successful series, The Classical World in Context, which this year, like last, concentrates on the exchanges between the classical world and ancient Persia. Professor Schlude, who's a man of many talents, historian, archaeologist, philologist, and versificateur amateur, as Jake and I were reminded thereof during our lunch today, works on the Roman Near East, and in particular on the relations between the early Roman and Parthian Arsacids empires. He's both an excellent historian who admirably controls the classical textual testimonies and a proven archaeologist who, with a good comprehension of the material culture, who to those among us who are conspicuously nescient in matters archaeological is rather awe-inspiring. His publications reflect this research interest. More recently, he co-edited an excellent volume called The Arsacid Romans and the Local Elites, Cross-Cultural Interactions of the Parthian Empire, and is working on a monograph on Parthia, Rome, and the politics of the ancient Near East, which is contracted, as I understand, with Routledge. His lecture today is solidly situated within the larger framework of transregional exchanges by advancing a more nuanced approach to understanding of Roman and Parthian wars by looking beyond Realpolitik as the main motivation for waging war. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schlude.
In 66 CE, something remarkable happened in Rome. The likes of it had never happened before. In that year, Tiridates, the brother of Arsacid king Vologases I, came to Emperor Nero in Rome. Parthians, to be sure, had come to Rome before in numerous embassies and exchanges. In many cases, they even involved prominent members of the Arsacid family arriving in Rome to stay as residents. Sometimes they were recalled by Parthian factions interested in obtaining an Arsacid to put up as a rival challenging a current king. This was different. Tiridates came for a crown, the crown of Armenia, to be precise. This was part of an agreement worked out in 63 CE between Nero and Vologases to settle their conflict over who would select the king of Armenia. It was a lengthy dispute between Rome and Parthia going back to the 1st century BCE. In this case, after nearly a decade of disagreement and conflict, Nero and Vologases agreed that Vologases could pick the candidate, his brother Tiridates, but that Nero would fix the diadem upon his head in the city of Rome. This was a bit of a schlep for a Parthian, you could imagine. So Tiridates came to Rome in 66. Not only Tiridates. The procession was a bit larger. It included Tiridates and a lengthy VIP list, including his wife and other royal family members and elites, including his own sons and the sons of Vologases and those of his brother Pacorus, his other brother Pacorus, the king of Media, and of Monobazus, the king of Adiabene. It also included 3,000 of those fierce Parthian cavalry that Romans loved to talk about. But at least this time they were running toward the Romans. The Romans most often seemed to have issues when they were running away from them. Little bit of insider Roman-Parthian humor for you. There aren't a lot of Roman-Parthian jokes, but we can work on that together. The spectacle of all of this was impressive, and it will deserve more discussion later. I begin with this story for a few reasons. First, it is an important part of the latest chapter that I've drafted for a book that I'm provisionally entitling Power Play in the Middle East, Rome, Parthia, and the Politics of Peace. Researchers, of course, love to draw from their most recent work. Finishing this project is my primary concern when I'm at the Getty for the next couple months. Next, I couldn't help but indulge parallels and ironies of my current visit to the Getty for its Persia program, and into UCLA to see you and visit you at the Port Davoud Center for the Study of the Iranian World. It's such a treat to be here, so thank you for having me here. The last time I was here, it was for the Cyrus Conference that took place now over 5 years ago. But it was one of the best conferences that I had attended, and a good example of the kind of programming that you do at the Port Davoud Center and that Rahim has been a champion for. So expanding the study of ancient Iran and putting it in a broader context, looking at it in the modern world as well, bringing together a range of different people to study this. This is a very worthy pursuit, and you are appreciated for the work that you are doing across our continent and beyond. So thank you, and thank you for having me. I feel maybe a bit like Tiridates coming to LA, the Rome of California. I hail from the interior plateau, or the plains, if you like, of Minnesota. I don't know all the customs that are here. I always have that Midwestern tendency to smile and to greet everyone I see. I like to wave. I do these things. It's hard to honk, though I had no issue doing that the other day on Sunset Boulevard when someone double parked in front of me. So I'm becoming a native. I'm getting there. It took all the will just not to wear flannel today, which is the traditional garb of the flatland that I come from. Though I still stayed with plaid, which is closely akin, sort of the dress-up flannel. I didn't bring my family yet, but I'm going to go back to Minnesota, and we're going to drive out in full Tiridates style. On the flip side, I feel like I'm visiting Iranian lands. I come to you to talk about Parthia, the most forgotten, I think, of the Iranian empires. But I come to this land as a visitor, as a foreigner, a specialist in the Near East, but from the perspective of Rome. I'm a classicist. Part of this may not come as a surprise. The Parthians did not have a historical literature, per se, as far as we know. What we know of them often comes from Greek and Roman sources along these lines, with all the bias that entails. It means that classicists often come across them and they take interest, at least some of them, and I count myself as one of them. And the upside is that those sources lend themselves to us, but the result tends to be, of course, a Eurocentric perspective. Much work has been done to balance that picture, and the work of Rahim, of course, is a very good example of that. I, too, try to appreciate the Parthian perspective. And that as well, we shouldn't forget, of more local perspectives of those Near Eastern peoples that are living between the Roman and the Parthian empires. They deserve to be part of that discussion as well. The more that we can do of all of this, of course, the better. Having said that, I'm not ready to let the Roman part of this equation go. I think there's still more to say about it. Now, I began with Tiridates and Nero. I suppose I could have begun with the tale of Crassus, that Roman governor of Syria in 54-53, and Orodes II, the Arsacid king at that time. That is the most invoked story of Roman-Parthian history, to be sure. Crassus invaded the Parthian Empire in 54-53. Across 2 campaign seasons, he entered Mesopotamia, bound for the Greek city Seleucia on the Tigris, and the western Parthian capital of Ctesiphon that neighbors it. At first, Crassus enjoyed some limited success in Mesopotamia in 54, but these quickly turned to disaster in the neighborhood of Carrhae in 53. Surenas, a noble of the Parthian Empire, soundly defeated him. The image with which we are left, thanks to Plutarch, is made for Hollywood. We are in the right place. Surenas had his head and his hand lopped off and sent it to Orodes, then celebrating a marriage alliance in Armenia with its new king Artavasdes. There, a Greek actor, Plutarch tells us, picked it up at a prime moment in a celebratory staging of Euripides' Bacchae. For those unfamiliar with the play, Theban king Pentheus refuses to honor Dionysus as a god, and Dionysus, as a result, drives the city's women and Pentheus' mother Agave into a frenzy. Thinking Pentheus a lion, they kill and dismember him. In Armenia, Orodes, Artavasdes, and all in their court watched as Agave returned home to her palace with Crassus's head in hand. This image of a Parthian king happily viewing the floating head of a Roman imperialist, it sticks with you. You didn't need to be there. The frequent celebration of this story serves to illustrate the normal understanding of the relationship between Rome and Parthia. This was a 300-year relationship marked by tension and violent conflict, the result of a brutal game of Realpolitik. Indeed, the story of ancient empire is not for those with an ethical bent. It was a zero-sum game of resources in which brutal imperialists were out to conquer and to expand. When Rome expanded east and Parthia expanded west, they came to clash in the Near East. In the process, Crassus was the first Roman to attack the Parthian Empire. What the details of his ultimate plan were, we'll never know exactly, but surely he was out for military prestige and to augment his already vast wealth, both of which he would use to fuel his future political career. This imperialism knew few bounds. It rarely had enough. Its goal was expansion, as a rule. For Rome, the drive was particularly acute. Hence, here we have a Roman violently attacking Parthia, not vice versa. Its specific culture made it aggressive and bellicose beyond the norm. These, of course, are the ideas of Realpolitik, and they go back to antiquity. The Greek historian Thucydides remains a bedrock for thinking about ancient empire, and modern empire too, I would add. For example, you might consider Graham Allison's work, Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap, in which he refers back to Thucydides trying to understand the modern relationship, in this case between the United States and China. His account of the Athenian siege of the island of Melos is one of the best examples of this theory. In 416 BCE, during a brief lull in the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians arrived at Melos to convince it to join the Delian League. In the so-called Melian dialogue, they argue for the necessity of Melian capitulation. In this context, Thucydides gives voice to a series of Athenian sentiments, the most famous of which is the following: the dominant exact what they can and the weak concede what they must. Also useful, though, telling, is another comment he makes. He has the Athenians at one point say, "Your hostility does not injure us as much as a friendship that brings weakness, while your hatred will serve as a clear example of power to those subject to us." In other words, resources go to the powerful, and the powerful, in this case, see friendship as weakness. The argument went nowhere. The Melians refused, and as a result, the Athenians besieged the island, eventually taking it. So that their theory would be lost on no one, they executed all men, they enslaved the women and children, and they colonized the island with Athenians. To turn to classical scholarship, these are the ideas that fuel much analysis of ancient empire, analysis that helps to contextualize the present violent narrative of Roman-Parthian history. Perhaps the most influential work over the past 40 years, surely the classic study, is William Harris's War and Imperialism in Republican Rome. Harris responded to previous scholars who argued that Rome was not consciously driving toward the acquisition of an empire, but rather expanded out of self-defense, a reading that often discounted an economic motivation for the Roman Empire. For Harris, Rome in the Middle Republic, and here he's thinking in particular of the 4th century to 2nd centuries BCE, Rome was an aggressive imperialist constantly engaged in military conflict, first in Italy, then in the Western Mediterranean, and then in the Eastern Mediterranean. At nearly every turn, Romans sought tangible resources useful to both the state and to the individual, especially to the individual. Harris, to be sure, noted the importance of achieving laus and gloria, praise and glory, through military victory for aristocratic commanders. But particularly important was the acquisition of the tangibles: property, plundered from the conquered; slaves, that is, the slaves of the conquered, and the conquered themselves, we should add, the defeated soldiers and their families who were taken as slaves; fiscal penalties, so-called indemnities; taxes of various forms. In the case of annexation, consistent taxes directly applied to the conquered by Roman authorities. These were particularly important for Roman aristocrats, all of these things, who used them to invest in more land, to work that land with an ever-increasing number of slaves, and to make public benefactions to gain voters' approval, to thereby secure further political office and additional military opportunities those would afford. This internal drive, based on a social ethos that valued war, was unusually strong among the Romans. Harris even uses the word pathological in his analysis. It should be noticed that Harris's focus is on the Middle Republic, a period that largely preceded that of Roman-Parthian relations, but his observations remain relevant for the 1st century BCE too, during which time Rome and Parthia made their first contact and they charted a course for their relations. Harris himself often remarks that the 1st century BCE remained a period of imperial expansion, fueled by the Roman love for bellicosity and economic benefits. There were some differences. The big one was that certain Roman elites in the 1st century were happy to go beyond the normal bounds of aristocratic ambition. Think in this case of Marius and Sulla, of Pompey and Caesar. And while Harris is mostly quiet on Parthia, he does note of Caesar and his planned Parthian campaign, upon which he was embarking in 44 when he was assassinated. He remarks, "If Caesar had lived, it would have been the most grandiose attempt that had ever been made to expand the empire." Harris's views of Parthia, then, while incomplete, are a part of this picture, at least in the 1st century BCE. Harris sees the period of the empire as operating differently, a result of the late Augustan tendency to maintain the status quo rather than to expand aggressively. Still, I would say his model can be extended into the empire if we consider Claudius's expansion in Britain, Nero's reorganization around the Black Sea. This involved turning Polemonian Pontus in the eastern Black Sea over to direct Roman rule and attaching western coastal cities to the province of Moesia. Some might also mention Nero's plans for Armenia, but we'll return to that again briefly. You can also think here of Trajan's campaigns in Dacia and Armenia and Mesopotamia. These give you a few examples. Other scholars, at any rate, have taken this general paradigm and applied it beyond the 2nd century BCE, including to Roman-Parthian relations. Slightly different is the approach of Arthur Eckstein in his Mediterranean Anarchy, Interstate War, and the Rise of Rome, the most substantial contribution to the discussion of ancient empire in the past decade. It offers an approach that is now being used to explain Roman and Parthian imperialism, so far before the Common Era. Like Harris, Eckstein's theory on ancient empire fits within the realm of realism, so we're still working with a cutthroat zero-sum power game. But Eckstein reacts against Harris's argument that Rome is a special case imperialist, its internal culture being the determining factor in its aggressive behavior. Instead, while he concedes that Rome's capability as an imperialist was rare and noteworthy, and he would emphasize that it derived from its structural approach to empire, which integrated others into the Roman state, not on the basis of ethnicity or geography, he argues instead that its drive to expand in general was not special. All other Mediterranean states shared it. The theory, as he explains, is based on 3 tenets. First, the ancient Mediterranean, and here he is thinking of the 8th century to the beginning of the 2nd century BCE, was characterized by interstate anarchy. This was the condition of lacking international law and/or a central authority capable of enforcing such a law, which resulted in chronic violence. Second, this interstate anarchy resulted in a universal desire for security. This then led to a constant pursuit, not only to survive and to maintain autonomy, but also to expand, to maximize one's power and stability. And third, and finally, the precise character of the balances of power in this system determined the presence or absence of conflict. The balance could be multipolar, bipolar, or unipolar. Multipolar involving the greatest instability and likelihood of war. In this theory, shifts in power, or so-called power transition crises, also create instability and conflict in multi- and bipolar interstate systems. In short, during the period of Rome's rise to power, and others are making parallel arguments with regard to Parthia, many states competed against one another to expand their power in any way they could toward the end of self-survival. A significant difference from Harris, then, is the focus on the state level in Eckstein. His is not an analysis that emphasizes the importance of individual human actors with their own desires and ambitions. This, I think, is a strength of Harris. This is not to say that Eckstein ignores it. He acknowledges the significance, but the individual nonetheless takes a back seat. These realist perspectives have shaped the discourse on Roman-Parthian relations. In their current form, they have left little room for the existence of interstate cooperation or interstate collaboration. This may be one reason why the whole of Roman-Parthian history is quite often, not always, but quite often viewed as one long war in which the giant of the West met the giant of the East in the 90s BCE, both intent on the conquest of the Middle East and the acquisition of its resources to enrich themselves. All of this was taking place till the Sasanians overthrew the Arsacids in the 220s. It was only the fall of the Parthians in this way that ended the Roman-Parthian contest. Indeed, there's little need to understand it in any other way. My question is whether this is the only way or the best way to understand the lengthy history of Rome and Parthia. Does it explain the whole of their interactions? And if not, what have we left out? And in that case, what is an alternative model, whether it ill fits the realist paradigm or simply looks to some less explored corner of it? Here's a spoiler alert. I don't reject the realist paradigm and its explanatory power when it comes to Rome and Parthia. This should set many of you at ease, right? Or maybe not. Maybe you were hoping I was going to say that, so you would have all kinds of aggressive questions, realist questions of your own in response. I agree with Eckstein. The ancient Mediterranean was a tough world. It was marked by chaos. It was marked by uncertainty, shifting balances of power, all of this with the result that its states sought to expand their power. This process tended to make tension constant and war frequent. And I agree with Harris. This explanation, this expansion for power, we might say empire, and specifically Roman Empire for Harris, resulted from a drive for economic resources in particular. But these are not sufficient in their current form or application for a full understanding of Roman-Parthian relations. While it's important to think about Rome as a state functioning similarly to its neighbors under the same pressures, we must remember that ancient empires were not just systems, but systems based on individual human beings. Again, Eckstein acknowledges this himself. I'm not trying to knock him here in any way, but this is important for understanding Rome and Parthia, whose interactions were guided by specific statesmen, generals, emperors, and kings, each with their own individual ambitions and anxieties. As for Harris, it's crucial to note that the cutthroat contest for tangible economic resources did not play out in a predictable way for Rome and Parthia, for individual Romans and Arsacids at every turn. It was not always about actually conquering one's rivals and amassing resources like territory, wealth, and power on an expanding imperial periphery. This was part of Roman imperialism when it came to Parthia, to be sure, but bellicose expansion and resource extraction were not ever the case. We need another model for Rome and Parthia, not one that disregards previous work. I'm not here to offer some rosy picture of Rome and Parthia as dedicated humanists, recognizing universal dignity in their world, happily reaching out their hands to create some utopian shared empire. Though the images of this, I would say, do surface at times, actually. We need a model that builds on previous work while recognizing the exceptions and what they have to offer us. I know that if any one of us would pick a life teacher, it likely wouldn't be Nero. He's not the best role model for a modern age, notwithstanding, I would note, the important revisionist observations that have been made about him in recent years. But when it comes to Rome and Parthia, Nero and Vologases and Tiridates, they all deserve more discussion. Most often Crassus and other violent opportunists like him seem to get the most attention. And if it's not them, well, then we like to dwell on Augustus, and we like to dwell on Phraates IV. In the late 1st century BCE, they not only avoided war, but they carried off a number of major diplomatic accomplishments, including diffusing a Parthian civil conflict, restoring the standards taken from Crassus in the 50s, and taking part in an important series of gift exchanges. On this charge, I count myself guilty too. This period is often irresistible. For us, it seems a bright, though brief, neoliberal beam of light breaking through some massive black cloud of realism. I would note, though, just parenthetically, that most would still see it as a dusty beam, maybe dustier than it actually was. But today, let's look elsewhere. For us, on the specific topic of Parthia, Nero is a good teacher, along with his Arsacid counterparts. As mentioned earlier, when Nero succeeded the Emperor Claudius in 54, Rome was again in a dispute with the Arsacids over Armenia. Indeed, Armenia was a key issue in the negotiation of their relationship over a lengthy period. It was a game of hot potato, or better, warm potato, in which each imperialist state wanted to keep their grips on that warm spud. I'm from the Midwest, so these kinds of expressions are just natural to me. Connecting the plateaus of Asia Minor and Iran, it had strategic importance. And as soon as each state included Armenia within its sphere of influence, the culture of imperialism made it difficult to abandon interest. For Parthia, this happened when Mithridates II assisted Tigranes the Great in securing the Armenian throne in 96 BCE. From the Parthian perspective, this made Tigranes a client king, Armenia a client kingdom. The extension of Roman influence came later, during the Second Mithridatic War, between 74 and 63, when Tigranes allied with Mithridates VI of Pontus and then suffered a decisive defeat at the hands of Lucullus at the Battle of Tigranokerta. Pompey then went on to organize Armenia as he saw fit, and to advertise at home Rome's conquest and assumed control of it. With that, Armenia was a part of each state's imperial culture. Hence the struggle to control it. Rome had hegemony over it in the 60s BCE. In the 50s, while Crassus moved in Mesopotamia, Orodes visited Armenia, then ruled by Tigranes the Great's son, Artavasdes II, and he reestablished Parthian interests there. In the 30s, when Orodes was succeeded by Phraates IV, Artavasdes played the field and seemed to cozy up to Rome, now in the person of Mark Antony. But he abandoned Mark Antony, who subsequently removed him from power. And as Antony then met his defeat in civil conflict with Augustus, Parthia installed Artavasdes' son Artaxias as Armenian king in the late 30s. From then till the time of Nero, Roman emperors and Arsacid kings wanted to have indirect control in Armenia, established by installing a king who ruled, theoretically, with your interests in mind. Most often, Rome was dominant, and Armenia fell within its sphere. Arsacid interventions were more the exceptions. For example, Phratakes intervened in 2 BCE. Artabanus III in 34 CE, and Vologases in the years after 51, when he placed Tiridates on Armenia's throne. Claudius did not directly respond, that we know of, and this brings us back to Nero, who refused this state of affairs. He mobilized Rome's forces under the generals Corbulo and later Paetus and sent them into Armenia. The result was a lengthy conflict, fully resolved only with Tiridates' visit to Rome in 66. The question is, how do we understand it? If some are believed, the resulting war fits the picture of Rome and Parthia's most violent outbreaks of conflict. One scholar, in fact, lumps Nero's efforts with those of emperor commanders Trajan and Septimius Severus, calling them all, quote, straightforward military campaigns. To an extent, there may be some truth to that. This was the most violent confrontation in over 80 years. Not since Antony and Phraates had Romans and Parthians directly fought one another. Not that the fighting came immediately. Corbulo had to train up his troops first. But by 58, he was actively taking control of Armenia and its principal cities, Artaxata in 58, Tigranokerta in 59. And he subsequently installed Tigranes VI as Rome's client king. In the process of this, while preparing to besiege Artaxata, Corbulo drew up with Tiridates and his forces, and they briefly engaged before the Parthians fled. This phase, was then followed by another period of conflict between 61 and 62. Fresh to his throne, Tigranes quickly engaged in prolonged raiding along his border with Adiabene, ruled by the Parthian vassal Monobazus. In response, Vologases fastened a diadem upon Tiridates' head, publicly appointing him Armenian king. And he sent a mixed force, including a division of his own attending cavalry, against Tigranokerta to enforce his will. A short siege ensued, but it was unsuccessful and soon called off. With Corbulo holding Syria, Nero now sent Paetus to deal with Armenia. It may even be that Roman policy took an unusually aggressive turn at this point. Paetus voicing his intention to, quote, impose tribute, laws, and Roman justice, not just the shadow of a king. Such language could suggest a new plan for a Roman province of Armenia, to be ruled directly by a Roman governor. We cannot know, however, whether this was a serious goal or a hollow threat designed to motivate the Parthians to negotiate. What cannot be disputed is the aggressive campaigning of Paetus from the east bank, of the aggressive campaigning of Paetus that further complicated the Roman position. In 62, while Corbulo pushed the Parthians from the east bank of the Euphrates to establish a bridgehead in Parthian territory, Paetus recklessly dashed into Armenia with 2 legions. The result was another engagement, this time ending in Roman defeat and disgrace. In this case, Vologases brought his Parthian forces into Armenia and attacked Paetus on its border with Cappadocia. And he forced the surrender of Paetus at Rhandaea under embarrassing terms. The Romans had to abandon all positions and supplies in Armenia. They even had to build the Parthians, apparently, a bridge across the Arsanias River before marching away, perhaps under a yoke, stripped of weapons and possessions, and in sight of the Roman dead, heaped up as a trophy, a final image, and no doubt smell before their junction with Corbulo's rescue detail. One might have thought peace was a distant hope, but in reality, they reached a resolution soon after. In spring of 63, Nero received an embassy from Vologases. He proposed that Tiridates was willing to receive his diadem from the Romans, but not at Rome. Tiridates was a magus, and Magian scruples prohibited crossing the sea. Instead, he could do so in the Near East, before the legions, their standards, and images of the princeps. Nero declined, removed Paetus from his post for incompetence, and reassigned Corbulo to Armenia. Taking the one-time route of Lucullus for its symbolic value, if nothing else, Corbulo attacked any Armenian nobles who had proven disloyal to Rome, even as he opened negotiations with Vologases. Corbulo and Tiridates then met personally and reached a settlement, subsequently carried out. Tiridates removed his diadem and placed it at the feet of a statue of Nero in the presence of both armies, and then traveled to Rome to pay homage to Nero and receive it back. This is a good moment to pause. As we have seen, tension and instances of real fighting between Romans and Parthians marked the interactions between Nero and Vologases. But was that all? Was this just a straightforward military campaign? Not in the least. A broader vision tempers this picture. While fighting there was, diplomacy was the primary and preferred method of exchange and resolution throughout this particular period. The sources document repeated communications and meetings among the kings, emperor, and generals involved. No less than a dozen major diplomatic exchanges are documented. More were likely. From this, it's clear that both sides wanted a diplomatic solution, and the military engagement must be understood in that light. Starting at least in 58, and 58 was the very start, the very year that campaigning started, the Romans advocated a compromise with Parthia, in which a Parthian appointee for the Armenian throne could be approved by Nero. In 61, Vologases came to prefer this proposal as well. But a final agreement on the matter and the precise arrangements for how it would be orchestrated took 2 more years to settle. The needs of a successful and superior military image at home had to be carefully balanced. Vologases and Nero both needed their domestic constituencies to see the settlement as won and wrested from the enemy. Vologases was ready for the compromise in 61, after he publicly had declared his intentions to fight Rome, after he publicly crowned his king during the same display, and then sent a force into Armenia to besiege the city of Tigranokerta. Only then did he send an embassy to Nero about the compromise. At that moment, however, Nero had the feeling that some other Roman victory was now necessary. We might put victory in parentheses here. He denied the embassy, and he sent Paetus to secure it. But Paetus was defeated and forced to surrender. So while Vologases was ready to deal again, proposing that Tiridates would, quote, proceed to the standards and images of the emperor where his kingship over Armenia could be inaugurated in the presence of the legions, once again, Nero was not. Nero mobilized more troops for the east and had Corbulo invade Armenia again, beat up on some disloyal Armenian nobles, and advance against the forces of Vologases and Tiridates. Only then could the Romans agree to what they themselves originally proposed. Military action was deemed necessary, but only to advance negotiation and make a settlement palatable at home. Tiridates' visit to Nero in Italy reveals what was also central: the theater of Roman-Parthian relations. What an emperor or king did abroad was often dictated by how he wanted to play it at home. In 66, Tiridates finally made his unprecedented visit to Rome. That it took some time is not a surprise. There was much to organize. Tiridates had a major entourage, and they all paraded by horse across the empire to Italy over a period of 9 months. All expenses paid by the Roman state to the tune of 800,000 sesterces a day. Every day across that period, residents of the Roman Empire witnessed a long, slow Parthian advance that acknowledged, to the thinking of many, Roman superiority with every step taken. First, they met Nero at Neapolis, where celebration included games, in which even Tiridates took part from his seat, apparently, shooting his Parthian bow and killing 2 bulls with 1 arrow to the delight of spectators. I think this would have played well in the Midwest as well. Then they proceeded to Rome. Once there, Nero offered the Roman people a triumph, with Nero playing the part of victorious general. In this performance, Nero sat at the heart of the city, high on the rostra in the forum, upon a curule chair, an enduring symbol of power for Rome's most powerful statesman. Wearing the attire of a triumphing general, he was surrounded on all sides by Rome's military standards, its senators, its soldiers in armor, civilians clothed in white, carrying laurel branches, and standing in the forum and on every roof as if replacing the terracotta tiles their bodies now hid from view. Each one strained ear to hear Tiridates supplicate Nero, his words translated into Latin for the Roman public. A translation that must have been careful indeed to capture the moment. We're left only with the Greek. "Master," he said, "I myself am the offspring of Arsaces, brother of kings Vologases and Pacorus, and your slave. And I have come to you to worship you, as I do Mithras, and will accept whatever future you spin for me. For you yourself are my fate and my fortune." Nero's response, too, deserves some remembrance. Nero says, according to the account, "You yourself have done well to come here in person, in order that you also may have the enjoyment of my very presence. For I myself happily give you what neither your father left you, nor your brothers bestowed upon and protected for you. I hereby make you king of Armenia, in order that both you and they may learn that I indeed have the power to take and confer kingdoms. All this left little doubt that Nero was responsible for the victory. Nero, the most powerful figure from the Atlantic Sea to the Hindu Kush. Each citizen then stretched neck to catch a glimpse of Tiridates, ascending a ramp only to fall at Nero's feet. This was Nero's cue to raise and lay a kiss upon him, then remove his headdress and replace it with a diadem. Nero was then hailed imperator, general, to signal the magnitude of his victory, and brought his own laurel as a victory offering to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, another act of a triumphing general. He finished up by closing the doors of the temple of Janus, a signal that war everywhere was over, the Julio-Claudian version of America's mission accomplished. This done, he escorted Tiridates to an appropriate and also public place to celebrate further, the theater. There they looked up to see purple curtains shimmering, with Nero in chariot embroidered at their center, glowing stars all about him, a sun god if ever his people had seen one. What did Tiridates make of this subjugation? An intriguing, if impossible, question. But we can make some observations. To start, deference is different from disgrace. While Tiridates subordinated himself to Nero, protocols put in place prevented his dishonor. Vologases saw to that, requesting through Corbulo that Tiridates not suffer, quote, the image of servitude, imaginem servitii. Instead, they were to consider him of equal rank with provincial governors and consuls, and allow him to wear his sword at all times, even if he had to nail it to a scabbard. He was even given scope to show off his archery skills. Yet, there's no question that the show at Rome was for Nero. The payoff for Tiridates, that came upon his homecoming in the Near East. In Armenia, he was in an excellent position. He left the region at the head of his troops as if on campaign, against Rome presumably, and then returned rich with resources, maybe even plunder in the eyes of some onlookers. Not only did he not pay for his ticket to Rome, but Nero also gave him a handsome treasure trove worth 200 million sesterces, and a skilled workforce with which to rebuild Artaxata. When he returned to Armenia, he too entered in triumph. What is more, he had the backing of Parthia and Rome. For a country as divided as Armenia in this period, he offered a focal point for loyalty of many parties, previously opposed to one another. Tiridates was so enthusiastic for Nero after all of these events, he apparently renamed Artaxata Neronea. It didn't stick. The period of Nero and Vologases stands to tell us a great deal about Roman-Parthian goals in the ancient Middle East. While there were direct military engagements between these two rulers, they routinely and purposely were restrained and mainly served as a mechanism to enable compromise and peace between their states. Aggressive imperial expansion was long a mutual interest of Rome and Parthia, but it was not always the goal in their relations. Each side knew that peace could be practical. Wars between these two were always uncertain. Crassus taught the Romans that in 53. Perhaps the Parthians best learned it in 39 to 38, when the Roman general Ventidius handily repelled them from Syria and killed their prince Pacorus on the field. The Roman historian Tacitus even gives voice to this idea. He assigns the following reflection to Corbulo on the verge of the settlement in 63. Corbulo is reported to have reflected, "Evidence against arrogance was the fact that many actions for the Romans, and some for the Parthians, had turned out well. Vologases would better protect the Parthian people through a Roman alliance than mutual injuries." The spin here is Roman, But clearly, the central point was accurate. War was a dangerous venture for them, and they both understood that. Nero and Vologases were savvy individuals who cared not to risk personal success on an all-out war. As in the Augustan period, diplomatic negotiation and compromise were still the order of the day. These events teach us something else about imperialistic motivations too. Roman Parthia were, of course, interested in the benefits of empire, but were these always concrete economic benefits? In this case, was Nero seeking to conquer territory with the aim of gathering vast quantities of plunder in battle and then extracting wealth, whether as direct taxation or another form of tribute? As we saw with Paius's comment, it was the annexation of a territory as a Roman province that brought direct taxation. Hence, Paius was ready to impose tributa after his intended conquest. But this Roman plan for Armenia, if it was ever seriously intended under Nero, was short-lived. At least when it came to Parthia and Armenia, Nero had something in mind other than conquest, annexation, and taxation, seen in many other instances in Roman imperial history. On the contrary, by permitting Armenia to remain a client kingdom, he passed on potential tax revenue. What is more, he spent exorbitantly to ensure that Tiridates came to Rome, and shelled out even more when he left. If we combine Nero's parting gifts to Tiridates, worth an estimated 200 million sesterces, with the cost of his trip to Rome, let's forget the return ticket, another 216 million sesterces. For those of you who are interested in math, that's 800,000 sesterces. We all have to work up budgets for our departmental offices, right? 800,000 sesterces for 9 months, or if you like, 270 days. If you add all this up, the total Roman expenditure was a cool 416 million sesterces. To put this in perspective, a Roman senator at the time of Augustus eventually was required to have property worth 1,200,000 sesterces in all. Presumably, the property qualification was comparable for Nero. This means that Tiridates cost Rome at least as much as the total property qualification of 346 senators, or more than half of the entire Roman Senate, which Augustus fixed at 600 members. The numbers game for antiquity is always tricky, but if the scale of this estimate is even close, then Tiridates made out like a bandit, or perhaps better, like a conquering king. In short, Nero's empire focused not only on swallowing wealth, it was especially focused on finding Nero's solutions valuable in the currency of propaganda. As a young emperor without military experience, he needed victory in war to legitimize his power. Sending armies to the east, winning some well-timed battles, and having a Parthian come calling was all he needed for the biggest celebration of power over Parthia in 2 generations. He considered it a good investment. So Nero was anything but a Trajan or a Septimius Severus. He was not a typical imperialist when it came to Armenia and Rome's relationship with the Parthian Empire. He did not show enthusiasm for war with Parthia, and he was content not only to let economic resources go, but even invest his own to reach a peaceful compromise, especially when the compromise could be played well at home in imperialist displays of military victory. Nor was this way of operating, I would mention, unique to Nero and Vologases and Tiridates. Constraints of time will not allow for a comprehensive review, but it should be noted that Roman-Parthian relations achieved 40 years of peace before Crassus. They were begun with diplomatic exchanges between Sulla and Mithridates II, then negotiations and collaborations between Lucullus and Pompey and Phraates II, which had their rocky moments, but kept both states from war and provided opportunities for individual personalities on both sides to showcase their authority. Crassus's campaign, then, was unprecedented in the context of Parthia. And yes, it led to more Roman-Parthian violence, 20 years of it. involving Parthian incursions west of the Euphrates in the late 50s BCE, eventually even a Parthian invasion that took in most of the Roman East in 40, followed by campaigns by Ventidius and Antony in the 30s. But then Augustus and Phraates kicked off a new period of relative peace that stretched, largely uninterrupted, for almost 150 years, continuously worked out by many parties on both sides. Today, I focused on Nero and Vologases in that equation. This, to my thinking, does not contradict the realist model. The Roman-Parthian contest was understandable in the interstate anarchy of the day, as a rivalry to aggressively expand power and acquire economic resources useful to the state and the individual, producing thereby periodic war as a result. But there was more to it. The application must be adjusted. The conflict was not relentless and endlessly violent, in fact. External insecurity and uncertainty motivated individuals on both sides to open wide windows of peace, even as internal insecurity motivated them to find ways to project power. But we must remember that when it came to satisfying these warrior cultures, there was more than one way to skin a cat. Often you could let the cat keep its skin, but with a mutual understanding. Let's don't, but say we did. In the end, peace was as much a part of the picture as war, and presentation as important as fact. Thank you.